my last video, I discussed 5 myths or misconceptions about Gaelic Ireland. This new video is a response to this and to some of the many comments on the video. Instead of correcting misconceptions, here I want to present some of the things we know about Gaelic Ireland. To start, it's probably best to define the subject matter. Generally speaking, by Gaelic Irish, I mean the Irish-speaking people of Ireland, their culture and their society. By extension, Gaelic Ireland means the historical period when Gaelic cultural, political and social structures existed. These structures went beyond Ireland, also including parts of Scotland and, for a short period, part of Wales. At times, these structures coexisted with English, Norman or Norse ones. It's important to put some dates on this historical period. So, when does the history of Gaelic Ireland begin? Most historians and archaeologists would see it as commencing with the Iron Age in Ireland, since the emergence of the Gaelic people in Ireland seems to have occurred at the same time as the use of iron. I do not want to discuss here the origin of the Gaelic people or the Irish language, whether they came from outside Ireland or developed internally or both. This is something I will deal with in a much later video. However, putting a date on either the beginning of the Iron Age or when Ireland can be called Gaelic is very difficult. Various dates have been advanced, but it's impossible to say for sure. Probably it occurred between 800 BCE and 500 BCE, but it could also have been 1000 BCE. Surprisingly, in contrast with Bronze Age Ireland, we know much less about the Iron Age in the country, at least until the emergence of Christianity. The early centuries of Gaelic Ireland are thus rather obscure. By way of contrast, we have much more information about the end of Gaelic Ireland. This begins with the Battle of Kinsale in 1602, which was surely the most decisive battle in Irish history, and marks the end of the Gaelic lordships in Ireland. It was followed by the flight of the Earls, the plantation of Ulster, numerous other political setbacks, and finally the defeats of the Cromwellian period. By the time of the Battle of the Boyne, Gaelic Ireland no longer existed as an important political force. The Gaelic nobility had mostly been killed, exiled or dispossessed. A few families, such as the O'Briens, managed to anglicise themselves and preserve their property, but at a cost. Having outlined the beginning and end of Gaelic Ireland and Gaelic history, let us turn to my first point. That is, that Gaelic Ireland was politically divided but culturally unified. Until the end of the 16th century, most of Ireland and part of Scotland shared a common Gaelic culture. This region shared a common language and culture, literature, customs, political structures, and even laws to an extent. However, politically they were deeply divided. From the early medieval period to the early modern, Ireland was divided into a large number of lordships which varied in power, size and influence. However, it's very important to point out that this was also the case of most of Europe until the early modern period. Whether in England, Scotland, France, Spain or many other places, the power of the monarch was often limited by the power of the nobility. Equally frequent were clashes between the monarchy and parts of the nobility, or between elites. Even in states seen as centralized, power was negotiated between the various elites. In the early modern period, more powerful and more centralized states began to emerge. England is an example here. However, before the Tudors came to power, England had been convulsed by the Wars of the Roses. Even when Henry VII came to power, he still had to deal with Yorkist revolts, while Henry VIII had to face the dangerous Pilgrimage of Grace, and Elizabeth faced numerous revolts. In Ireland, the 9 Years' War was crucial here. The defeat of Hugh O'Neill, the flight of the Earls, and the plantation of Ulster destroyed the chance of the emergence of a state which incorporated the Gaelic nobility. Instead, a more colonial state was built on tabula rasa of the destruction of the Gaelic political system. Although the Gaelic political system was fragmented, this does not mean it could never have become united. During the 10th and 11th centuries, various kings came close to achieving some sort of dominance over the country, from Neil Glundubh to Brian Boru, with the latter coming closest. Most were thwarted by the Norse, often being killed. While Brian Boru did achieve dominance over Ireland for a short period, his Pyrrhic victory at Clontarf resulted in his death and of several members of his family, including his heir apparent Murcha. Brian shattered the dominance of the Nail, but he failed to replace the structure he destroyed. The feuding over the High Kingship would continue until the Norman invasion changed everything. Again, it should be noted that this is not an exception in a European context. Indeed, at the end of the 11th century, there were few united European kingdoms. England was more centralized and unified than most, but it should not be forgotten here that the territories ruled by English kings, especially in France, would expand and contract a lot over the following centuries, while England itself would be subject to numerous wars among the elites, from the so-called anarchy to the Wars of the Roses. This can be clearly seen in the Norman lordships established in Ireland, where there was constant feuding. 2. The seductiveness of Gaelic culture. Gaelic culture was also something quite seductive to outsiders. As Geoffrey Keating argued in the 17th century, successive waves of invaders or immigrants to Ireland became Gaelicized, or even Irish if you like, notably the Norse and the Normans. Although Keating does not say so, some of the first wave of New English who came in the 16th century also became Irish. For example, one of the nephews of Henry Bagnall was executed by the Cromwellians, having fought with the Confederacy of Kilkenny's forces. Following the successful establishment of Norman or English rule over much of Ireland, large numbers of settlers came to Ireland. However, Gaelic culture proved surprisingly resilient, especially the Irish language, meaning that the country did not become Anglicized. While there were some areas where most people spoke English, in the Pale and cities, even there many, if not most, would have been able to speak Irish. This was necessary to live and work in Ireland. 2 important trends can be pointed out here. First, an attack on Gaelic culture and the Gaelic people. This commenced at the time of the Norman invasion. The Gaelic Irish were constantly belittled and disparaged, being labelled as savages, uncivilized, even pagans. This is what is called othering, making them into others who are excluded from civilization and the rule of law, something which can have horrific impacts. It can be found in text running from Geraldus Cambrensis in the 13th century to Spencer in the 16th, and to English officials such as Chichester at the same time. However, at the same time, over a period of centuries, many of the newcomers would either become Gaelicized or at least able to integrate both Gaelic and English customs. Often this could appear contradictory. As Ruth Canning has shown, in the late 16th century, the Old English defined themselves as English, indeed as English as those born in England, and held strongly to the idea of defending the Old English kingdom against the Gaelic Irish, shedding their blood to do so. On the other hand, most would have been able to speak Irish. The Old English and Gaelic Irish elites intermarried a lot. They were also intertwined commercially, militarily, and in terms of labour. Attempts were made to stop Gaelicization. Most infamous are the Statutes of Kilkenny. These are much misunderstood. Rather than trying to outlaw or eradicate the speaking of Irish or other Gaelic customs, their objective was to stop these spreading among the English colony in Ireland. The statutes failed, and in the aftermath of the Black Death, the Bruce invasion, and the Gaelic revival, many among the Old English elite were described as Hibernians, Hibernis ipsis, or more Irish than the Irish themselves. However, it is important to point out here that while many Old English became Gaelicized, could speak Irish, and interact with Gaelic customs and politics, in terms of identity, they saw themselves as English, and would continue doing so until the 17th century. In the late 16th century, when Elizabeth's misgovernance had created the strongest opposition she would face during her reign, this othering of Gaelic Ireland and the latter's seductiveness can both be found. For example, Edmund Spenser, one of the most famous poets of the Elizabethan Golden Age, was an official in the Elizabethan government in Ireland and a settler. He was also the author of the virulent A View of the State of Ireland, which advocated brutal methods of dominating the country, notably the large-scale killing of Gaelic Irish. In other words, civilizing them with the sword. Drawing on Calvinism, Spencer also accused the Old English of having degenerated and having become Gaelic or Irish. One of the ways he said this happened was through the use of Gaelic wet nurses, with the breast milk of the Gaelic women helping to corrupt the Old English and make them Irish. Unfortunately, Freud does not seem to have read this text, as I'm sure he would have written a very interesting analysis of this. Yet, at the same time, various English set up their own Irish lordships, such as Bingham and Bagnall, Hugh O'Neill's adversary. Indeed, Spencer set himself up in Kilcolman Castle in Cork. Furthermore, as large numbers of Gaelic Irish served in Elizabeth's forces in Ireland, many English officers and officials would have been able to speak Irish. Many also married Gaelic Irish women. Notable here is the infamous Captain Thomas Lee, who had himself painted as a Gaelic kern. It's also worth mentioning here James O'Neill's point about the transformation of warfare at this period, namely that around 1600 the English army began to copy certain aspects of Gaelic warfare, notably ditching armour and becoming lighter in order to fight in more difficult areas such as bogs and forests. Attacks on Gaelic Ireland, especially the depicting of the Gaelic Irish as savages, uncivilized or even inhuman, were common from the Norman invasion to the Elizabethan wars. Yet, at the same time, Gaelic culture proved to be very strong and indeed seductive. However, defeat in the 9 Years' War, the flight of the Earls, and the Anglicization of some of the few Gaelic lords left, notably the O'Briens as well as some McCarthys, followed by the destruction and horrors of the Cromwellian period, destroyed the political and social structures of Gaelic Ireland. By the end of the 17th century, there was no longer a distinct Gaelic culture or people. The majority of the country still spoke Irish, but Gaelic Ireland had been destroyed. 3. The Dynamism of Gaelic Ireland. In my previous video, I mentioned that Gaelic Ireland is often portrayed as something archaic and frozen in time. Many English saw it as backward, and Gaelic Irish as savages in desperate need of civilizing, even if this meant killing large numbers of them. Since the emergence of Romanticism in the late 18th century, a new view emerged, interrelated to the idea of Celtomania. This saw Gaelic Ireland as something non-modern, magical, and often otherworldly. Both are wrong. Gaelic Ireland was a dynamic society, as modern as any other European country, in touch with political, economic, social, religious, and military developments elsewhere in Europe. This is something obvious, but unfortunately it needs to be stated constantly. Even though Ireland was not part of the Roman Empire, the Gaelic Irish interacted with the Roman world. Indeed, the first Gaelic form of writing, Ogham, was based on the Roman alphabet. Like all societies, Gaelic Ireland changed. Some changes are obvious, such as the introduction of Christianity. Others are less well known, such as changes within Christianity in Ireland or the spread of new beliefs. Gaelic Ireland may have been poorer than other parts of Europe. It was underdeveloped, though this underdevelopment had much to do with the way Gaelic Ireland was treated. As Hugh O'Neill and many others argued, England's rule over Ireland had been bad for the Gaelic Irish and probably prevented their proper economic development. It is worth giving a couple of examples highlighting the complexity of Gaelic society and how it changed. One is a ring fort. These are the most common archaeological monument in Ireland. It is estimated that there are 45,000 ring forts in the country, a number that was probably higher in the past, as many have disappeared or been destroyed. Some scholars argue that the name ring fort is a misnomer, as they did not have a military purpose and were not forts. Rather, they were homestead, probably occupied by extended families. However, at the same time they were defensible, and the stone or earth walls certainly acted as a type of fortification. While this would not have been enough to hold off a large force, it was probably enough for the most common type of fighting in Ireland, when they were built, namely low-intensity cattle raiding. A stone wall or an earth wall and ditch would have presented a group of armed raiders with a formidable obstacle, especially if there was a wooden palisade on top. Moreover, if there were a few ring forts in the area, as was very common, a strong in-depth defence could exist. Recent important research into ring forts, notably the work of Matthew Stout, has resulted in a better understanding of their relationship with Gaelic society. They actually date from the early Christian period, primarily between the 5th and 10th centuries AD. Second, while they are often looked at as individual ring forts, they existed in networks of ring forts, monastic settlements, and other constructions. Using documentary sources, Stout advances a model for ring fort distribution, with a high-status ring fort occupied by a high-ranking individual being surrounded by ring forts held by individuals of lower status. In this network of ring forts, the one occupied by the higher-status individual would have provided some sort of protection to the others. High-status ring forts thus acted as a foci for the less powerful ring forts, providing a sort of defence in depth. The emergence of ring forts seems to be associated with the rise of Christianity in Ireland, as well as other economic and social changes. While too often Gaelic society is presented as something that rarely changed, that was the same in 1500 AD as it was in 500 AD or 500 BC, like any society, it underwent large transformations. Christianity was one such major change. There were many others, including an expansion of agricultural activity and forest clearance. A new type of plough and a horizontal mill improved the productivity of agriculture and probably resulted in a population increase. It has been speculated that this led to the construction of many thousands of new ring forts. Ring forts, Christianity, and improved agriculture thereby led to a transformation of our society. However, ring forts declined around 1000 AD, if not before. There were probably many factors for this. The incursions and settlement of the Norse was probably quite important, as these resulted in new forms of warfare in Ireland and the emergence of relatively large urban settlements. Another was a rise of powerful lords, leading to a form of centralisation. There were probably many other factors, such as new forms of settlement. However, this is still an area of speculation for now. Another example is Gaelic law. While this is often called Brehon law, this is not the most accurate term, as this name seems to have been coined in the Romantic period. The way Gaelic law is described in popular histories, there was a clear legal code operating in Gaelic Ireland from sometime in the 7th or 8th century to the beginning of the 17th. In other words, it was something that did not change. Moreover, some people seem to think that the legal texts that form the corpus of Gaelic law accurately describe Gaelic society, rather than being an aspiration. For example, the famous Con Adamonon supposedly protected women, children, and non-combatants during warfare, meaning that none of these were affected by war. However, the reality was far different. The Con is still important since it was a commendable attempt to impose some sort of rules on war. Another example is that some argue that women had a much better position in Gaelic Ireland due to these laws. However, as in any society, there is always a huge difference between theory and reality. Gaelic laws changed. From early on in the Christian period, they would have been influenced by canon law. After the Norman invasion, they would also have been influenced by English law. Indeed, in many lordships there would have existed a hybrid or mestizo legal structure, combining both legal systems. While it is often difficult to know how Gaelic law actually operated in practice, since there did not exist a judicial structure as such, it is possible to make some conjectures. First, the most powerful would often have taken advantage of their position to interpret the law to suit themselves, as happens everywhere. Second, there would undoubtedly have been squabbles and conflicts between the Brehon, in other words, Brehons or judges, the church, and various other elites, and within all of these groups. Third, the dynamism of Gaelic society, in which lordships expanded and contracted, grew or disappeared, would have been reflected in the implementation of Gaelic law. Looking through the annals or other historical sources, it can be seen, on the one hand, that the law was frequently ignored by those in power. On the other, For it to survive as something that continued to be used into the early modern period, it must also have been very dynamic, adaptable to different situations and dramatically changed circumstances. This is the same with any type of law. It changes, and interpretations of it change. In other words, rather than describing Brehon law as something ahistoric, it is better to contextualize it in specific historical circumstances. 4. Gaelic Septs and Lordships. As also stated in my previous video, the concept of clan does not adequately describe the Gaelic situation, especially in its most popular usage. It is something unable to deal with the dynastic dynamism of Gaelic Ireland. The word sept is more adequate, since it lacks the romantic underpinning of the word clan. Gaelic politics was dominated by dynastic groups, usually related to a male ancestor, such as Niall of the Nine Hostages, his sons Owen and Conall, in the case of the Northern Nail, or Owen and Conall Cork, the ancestors of the Owenocta and the McCarthys. However, these groups frequently changed as they expanded or contracted, and new branches emerged or parts split off. Their names also changed. Hence, we have the Northern Nail and the Kenal Owen, one of its branches. Out of the latter there emerged the O'Neills, who were displaced by the McLaughlins for more than a century before the O'Neills re-emerged. The O'Neills divided into numerous branches. In 1590, the O'Neills of Dungannon, led by Hugh O'Neill, but also including his brothers Cormac, MacBaron and Art, were the dominant branch. Other branches included the two Clandy boys, the Fews, the MacShanes, in other words the many sons of Shane O'Neill, and the O'Neills of Killitra. The same could be said for all the Gaelic lordships in Ireland, and indeed the Old English ones, as there were numerous Butler and Fitzgerald lords. Rather than clan, the key to understanding Gaelic society, especially in the post-Norman period, is the lordship. This was the basic unit of the Gaelic world. Probably the best description of how this operated can be found in Hiram Morgan's Tyrone's Rebellion, one of the best books for understanding what Gaelic Ireland really was like. Numerous lordships existed. However, not all were equal, as they existed in a type of hierarchy. The most powerful were the regional powers, such as the O'Neills of Dungannon, the O'Donnells, the McCarthy Moors, or the O'Briens. Under them were various sublordships, the Earhy in Irish. These included the Maguires, O'Cahons, McSweeneys, O'Reillys, O'Sullivans, etc. The relations between the Earhy and their overlords were often fractious, as the former sought more autonomy and the latter more control. Another type of lordships consisted of the cadet branches, which had emerged from a dominant group in the lordship, i.e. the Dungannon O'Neills. Usually, there could be great friction among these different types of lordships. This opened the way for the English government to limit the power of the Gaelic lordships, since there were also discontented lords who could be used against the most powerful lordships. Within a lordship, there were also various smaller dynastic groups which held on to certain positions. The O'Hagans, for example, held control of Tullahogue, the traditional inauguration place of the O'Neills, while the O'Donnellys were traditionally the marshals of the O'Neills. As might be expected, these traditions varied. In the aftermath of the O'Neill Civil War of the 1550s, the O'Hagans would be very close to Hugh O'Neill, and the O'Donnellys to Shane and his sons. Certain families also dominated important religious places. Indeed, there was even an Irish name for the families which held hereditary control of important churches, Erenach. In the late 1590s, after the death of McCarthy Moore, a survey was carried out of his lands, referred to as the Desmond Survey, as the area McCarthy Moore held was called Desmond. This survey is a treasure trove, since it provides an amazing amount of detail on the extremely complex pattern of landholding in Desmond. The majority of land in Desmond was actually held by O'Sullivan septs, such as O'Sullivan Moore, O'Sullivan Beara, the McCrahons, or Mac Fionn Dove. After this came the McCarthy septs, such as McCarthy Moore, Schlucht Cormac, Schlucht Donald Bricht, Schlucht Donald Fineen, Schlucht Owen Moore of Cushmain, Clan Ty Kitta, and many, many others. In addition, the O'Donohues also held a considerable portion of land. As well, the survey also identifies the services, or really taxes or rents, imposed by McCarthy More on lower lords. These included Gurm Slua, which was the rising out, Sorin, or maintenance, Quid Iha, a night's board and lodging for the lord and his entourage, Gal Oglig, the imposition of Gala Glass, and another one corresponding to the imposition of Cairn, and Cairn Biog, a small land tax for the lord's wife, as well as various others. Two of the most important differences in Gaelic lordships were land ownership and succession. Con Bacach O'Neill may have been Lord of Tyrone and exerted control over Maguires, O'Cahons, and O'Reillys. However, he owned very little of this land directly. While he may have owned some land, much of what he controlled was attached to the office he held. This meant he did not have the right to sell it. In some areas it was held by the sept and could even be periodically redistributed. Most Earls held their own lands under the same complicated conditions. This is one of the reasons why surrender and regrant was so popular, since an O'Neill, O'Brien, O'Donnell, or small lord could find themselves as a substantial landholder. Unfortunately for the Tudor monarchs, while this seemed an excellent mechanism to undermine Gaelic Ireland, it created turmoil, as those excluded by this policy objected vehemently. In terms of succession, the oldest son did not automatically inherit. Sometimes they did, and many lords attempted to establish some sort of primogeniture. However, one of the greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses of Gaelic Ireland was that theoretically anyone within 4 generations of a previous lord could become the new lord. In many accounts, the new lord is said to have been elected. This is a misrepresentation. First, the most powerful lords would often appoint lesser lords. O'Donnell would choose the next O'Doherty and O'Neill the next Maguire or O'Reilly. In the larger lordships, the most powerful candidate would claim the position. However, there would often also be some sort of inauguration ceremony, which frequently involved the gathering of large groups. In addition, conflicts over succession were frequent. While this may have ensured that the lordship would be held by a strong lord, it opened the way for interference from the English or indeed from other lordships. Finally, it's worth pointing out the importance of military power. Gaelic lords had to be powerful. Accession to the lordship was dependent on them having more power than their rivals. While their rule rested on a type of social contract, they had to protect those they ruled over, whether peasant or minor lord. Failure to do so meant that their peasants, their Earls, could transfer their allegiance elsewhere, or in the case of peasant, run away, or that the lord could be overthrown. Interestingly, Hiram Morgan has shown that the collapse of the lordship of the Isles in the 16th century benefited the most powerful Gaelic lordships in Ulster by making increased numbers of soldiers available to them. These were hired by O'Neill and O'Donnell and imposed on their Earls, simultaneously weakening the latter and strengthening the former. 5. Could Gaelic Ireland have survived the 9 Years' War? For the final point, I want to look at the end of Gaelic Ireland. As I've mentioned, defeat in the 9 Years' War led to the destruction of Gaelic Ireland. The 9 Years' War is the pivotal moment in modern Irish history. The defeat of Hugh O'Neill ended the possibility of the emergence of a different type of state in Ireland, one where Gaelic Irish and Old English elites would have been involved in the governing of the country. James I really dropped the ball here. Hugh O'Neill would have been a considerable asset to James, and if kept on side, would have been of great help in the governance of Ireland. However, perhaps afraid of alienating the English who had their eyes on making fortunes in Ireland, James allowed Chichesters and others a free hand. This included the persecution of O'Neill, who ultimately fled to the continent, leading to the plantation of Ulster. For a long time in the historiography, including in Irish nationalist works which failed to understand the nature of the war, the 9 Years' War was seen as a doomed but magnificent failure. With Gaelic Irish victories, the inevitable defeat at Kinsale, Some more heroics, notably by Sullivan Beara, and then English victory, which was always going to happen. However, I have a different opinion, one based on the historiography of the war that has emerged over the last 30 years or so, starting with Hiram Morgan's Tyrone's Rebellion, and including other works by him, such as his edited volume on Kinsale, and the works of other writers such as James O'Neill, John McGurk, Ruth Canning, and John McCavitt, amongst others. English victory in the 9 Years' War was not inevitable. For much of the war, Hugh O'Neill's Gaelic Confederacy outfought the English. They were often better trained, better supplied, and, at times, better paid. In the final years of the war, England's massive advantage in terms of wealth, manpower, and resources allowed England gain an advantage. Much of Ireland was brought under English control again. However, this was based on a huge and very expensive English army, which came close to bankrupting Elizabeth, and which forced her to sell off Crown lands. Moreover, before Kinsale, the English failed to defeat Hugh O'Neill. Mountjoy was Elizabeth's most successful general in Ireland. Before Kinsale, he and O'Neill clashed 3 times. In none of these battles did Mountjoy win a victory. However, he lied about them and told England they were victories. Yet, none of them were. Kinsale changed everything. Both Mountjoy and O'Neill gambled on this battle. Mountjoy besieged a Spanish force which had landed there, despite O'Neill telling them on various occasions that a force of below 6,000 should land at Limerick or somewhere more to the north. O'Neill and O'Donnell then marched south, evading the large English garrison surrounding Ulster. They, in turn, blockaded Mountjoy. In horrendous weather, everyone suffered, but the English suffered most. Even in normal conditions in Ireland, Elizabethan forces had horrific mortality rates. At Kinsale, they were even higher. Mountjoy appeared to have lost his gamble. Thousands of English died or got sick. All the Gaelic and Spanish forces had to do was wait, and victory would have been theirs. This was something normal in the period, where sieges could go on for many months, or, at times, even years. However, just when victory was in their grasp, the impatience or stupidity of the Spanish commander, Don Juan de l'Aquila, threw Mountjoy a lifeline. De l'Aquila insisted O'Neill take offensive action. In a plan that Hiram Morgan has described as mad from the Gaelic point of view, O'Neill was supposed to march his army up to a certain point in the viewpoint of the English. Then de l'Aquila would sally out, somehow avoid the massive English fortifications, and meet up with O'Neill. This plan horrified O'Neill and O'Donnell, who saw it for the disaster that it was. They refused to take part in it at first, as they realized it would offer the English the chance at a decisive battle where their cavalry could be used to great effect, something that O'Neill had always avoided. After all, he was not fighting a Clausewitzian war to destroy the enemy. Rather, he was fighting a political war in what mattered was survival. As long as O'Neill and his political and military potential remained, he was winning. This is not something commonly understood. Elizabeth was old, and when she died, the war would end. Upon her death, the warrants of Mountjoy and the other English commanders would end. In effect, the English state would end and only resume with the new monarch. O'Neill knew this, so did Mountjoy. Unfortunately, de l'Aquila did not, or else he did not care. He insisted that O'Neill and O'Donnell comply with his plan. No negotiation was allowed, obey it or not. The Gaelic lords resisted. De l'Aquila then threatened to surrender. O'Neill and O'Donnell were forced to comply. De l'Aquila told them they just had to reach a certain place, then he would sally out. O'Neill reached this place. The English army sallied out, but de l'Aquila remained in Kinsale and lost the war. His plan allowed Mountjoy's cavalry to charge O'Neill's veterans, just after they had been disrupted by the retreat of their own cavalry. The result was a disaster. It was probably the most decisive battle in Irish history, yet it should never have been fought. Elizabeth won the war at Kinsale due to De L'Aquila's idiocy and the bad luck of the Gaelic cavalry retreating into their own forces and disordering them. If the battle had not been fought and the siege had continued, Mountjoy would soon have been forced to retreat to Cork. Even after their victory, it was months before the English army was able to take the field again. In the event of a defeat or retreat, this recuperation would have taken even longer. O'Neill would then probably have been undefeated when Elizabeth died, and Gaelic and Irish history would have been far different.